The chamber had gone quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone in them is waiting for someone else to be the first to admit they were wrong. I sat near the back, as I always did, recording device open, watching a dozen delegates rehearse an apology they had spent 3 months drafting for a species that had not spoken to any of us in 7 years. My name is Voss Idren, and I served at the time of the reconciliation address as Senior Transcription Officer for the Concord's Office of Historical Reconciliation, a department created, as far as I could tell, entirely so that someone could eventually stand in front of a camera and say the word sorry on behalf of an entire galaxy. It was not glamorous work. I cataloged drafts. I logged revisions. I made certain that when history asked what exactly the Concord had said and when, there would be an answer on file. That day, my only task was to record the final reading of the reconciliation address before it was formally transmitted to Earth. 7 years is a long time for a room to sit with its own guilt. Long enough for the celebration over humanity's exile to curdle slowly into something quieter and far less comfortable. A low, persistent unease that had crept through Concord leadership as reports continued arriving, year after year, of a border no one had ever successfully crossed uninvited, a species that had gone silent not because it had weakened, but because it had simply stopped finding a reason to speak to us. 7 years of silence from a species the galaxy had once been so certain it understood. 7 years was long enough, apparently, for guilt to finally outweigh fear. We regret the circumstances that led to the exile accord, the draft read in the careful, over-negotiated language of a document written by committee. We acknowledge that certain assumptions made during that period may not have reflected the full truth of the matter, and we extend, on behalf of the Concord, our sincere hope for renewed understanding between our peoples. I remember thinking, as I logged the final revision, that it was a remarkably careful sentence for something meant to sound like an apology. It admitted nothing specific. It named no mistake. It simply gestured, politely, and at great length, toward the general idea of regret, without ever once saying plainly what the Concord believed it had done wrong. Near the edge of the drafting room, apart from the small crowd of officials congratulating themselves on finally finishing the address, stood an old Farai archivist I recognized from years of passing references in older registry files. Dessa Wren, long past the point where anyone expected her opinion to matter in a room like this, yet somehow always present in rooms exactly like this one. She was reading the final draft on a portable display, her expression unreadable in the way that had made junior officers uneasy about her for decades. "You've read it twice already," I said, mostly to have something to say. "I'm looking for the part where we say what we're actually apologizing for," she said without looking up. "It says we regret the circumstances." "It says nothing," she said. "Voss, do you know what happens when you apologize to someone for the general idea of a mistake without ever naming the mistake itself?" I admitted that I did not. "You're not actually asking them to forgive you," she said. "You're asking them to do the work of figuring out what you meant and then forgive you for that instead. It's not an apology. It's a test to see if they'll do the emotional labor of writing the honest version themselves." She set the display down and looked at me directly for the first time. "Humanity has spent 200 years being extremely precise about language, Voss. I would not send this draft if I wanted an answer. I wanted to tell her that the Reconciliation Office had spent 3 months on this address, that a dozen senior diplomats had reviewed every line, that surely they understood the weight of what they were sending better than an aging archivist, reading it once from the back of a drafting room. But something in her certainty settled into my chest, the way it always seemed to when she spoke, and I found myself unable to simply dismiss it. The address was transmitted formally 3 days later, broadcast toward the exile boundary through the last confirmed relay coordinates on file, accompanied by a small diplomatic escort ship sent to await a response. The Concord's Public Relations Office had already prepared the celebratory framing before a single word came back. "A new chapter begins," the headlines read. "The Concord extends the hand of reconciliation." Broadcasts across a dozen worlds showed footage of the transmission being sent, delegates shaking hands, quiet music playing under images of the exile boundary, now framed not as a wound but as a bridge finally being built. No response came, not that day, not the following week. The escort ship maintained its position at the boundary, its logs recording nothing but the same steady, familiar signal that had marked the border for 7 years, patient, unchanged, giving no indication that the message sent toward it had been received, acknowledged, or even noticed at all. I filed my first report exactly as the office required, describing the silence as an expected delay, a species taking appropriate time to consider a formal diplomatic address before responding in kind. I recommended patience. It was, I told myself, the professional conclusion. The reply from Reconciliation Office leadership came back within a day, brief and reassuring in the way such replies always were. Noted, continue monitoring. Response likely delayed by translation or internal deliberation. I should have felt reassured. Instead, I found myself thinking again about Dessa's words in the drafting room, about tests and honest versions, and the particular kind of silence that follows an apology no one actually meant to be specific. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The escort ship's logs remained unchanged, the boundary signal continuing its same patient rhythm, giving no acknowledgment that anything sent toward it had mattered at all. Concord leadership, growing uneasy in a way the public broadcasts carefully avoided showing, quietly commissioned a second draft. Shorter this time, more direct, though still, I noticed as I logged the revisions, carefully avoiding any specific admission of what exactly had prompted the original exile vote 7 years earlier. I raised the observation once, cautiously, during a review session. If the first address wasn't specific enough, I said, perhaps the second should name what we're actually apologizing for. The response from the senior diplomat overseeing the draft was polite but firm. Specificity invites liability, Officer Idrin. Vague reconciliation is a diplomatic tool. Precise admission is a legal one. We are not prepared to open that door. I logged the note as instructed and said nothing further, but I found myself, in the weeks that followed, quietly reviewing the original Exile Accord archives on my own time, reading through the transcripts of the vote 7 years earlier, with a closeness I had never previously had reason to apply to my own department's history. What I found unsettled me more than I expected. The original vote had not simply exiled humanity in the vague, mutual sense the reconciliation address implied. It had been passed on the explicit justification, recorded plainly in the transcripts, that humanity's continued presence within Concord space represented an unmanageable existential threat that no diplomatic solution had ever been permitted to properly address. Not a mutual parting, not a regrettable circumstance. A vote to remove a people the Concord had decided, formally and on the record, it would rather not understand than risk continuing to fear. The second address, when it was finally transmitted 6 weeks after the first, fared no better. The escort ship logged the same unbroken silence, the same steady boundary signal, undisturbed by anything sent toward it. It was during the review of that second silence that the task force was quietly reassembled. The same Border Security Division that had investigated the original exile boundary years earlier now reconvened under a new, more careful designation, the Reconciliation Verification Committee. I was assigned to it, given my history logging both the original exile proceedings and the recent addresses, and found myself once again aboard a Concord vessel, the Halvorn Reach, in a briefing room with delegates I recognized from years earlier, all of them older now, and considerably less certain than they had once been. Talon Voss, the Farai strategist who had led the original border investigation, stood at the head of the room, his arms folded tightly behind his back. 2 formal apologies have now been transmitted toward the exile boundary over the past 2 months, he said. Neither has received so much as an acknowledgment of receipt. I want to be clear about what that means. It does not mean the messages were lost. Boundary sensors confirm both transmissions reached their destination successfully. Then why the silence? The same Vandari delegate from years earlier asked. Older now, her posture carrying the particular weariness of someone who suspected she already knew, Talon activated a display showing the full text of both addresses side by side, sections highlighted in a pale amber that I recognized immediately as every instance of vague or non-specific language. Our language specialists ran a structural analysis on both transmissions, he said. Neither address contains a single specific admission of what the Concord believes it did wrong. Both rely entirely on generalized regret. Given what we now understand about how carefully humanity constructs language, This committee's working theory is that the silence is not confusion. It is a response. A response to what? To an apology that asked them to do the work of writing it honestly, instead of doing that work ourselves, Talon said quietly, and I felt something settle cold in my chest at hearing, from him, almost exactly what Dessa Wren had told me in the drafting room months earlier. I was assigned, in the weeks that followed, to work directly with the committee's small analysis team, tasked with drafting a third address, one built for the first time on direct historical record rather than diplomatic generality. It was difficult work. Every specific admission the Reconciliation Office had spent years carefully avoiding had to be located, verified, and stated plainly. The exact justification recorded in the original vote transcripts, the explicit language naming humanity, an unmanageable threat rather than a people worth continued diplomatic effort. The quiet decommissioning of monitoring stations that had, we now understood with considerable discomfort, essentially handed humanity the exact border it had already been quietly preparing to hold. I sat one evening with Marcus Ilya, the human liaison who had remained embedded in Concord territory since the original exile vote, one of the very few humans still present anywhere in Concord space, his presence tolerated for years as a diplomatic formality that had never seemed to matter until now. "You've seen the third draft," I said. "Is it specific enough?" He read through it slowly, longer than I expected, before answering. "It's honest," he said finally. "That's different from specific. You've named what happened. You haven't yet said why it mattered that you were the ones who did it." "What do you mean?" "An apology that says we were wrong to fear you is an admission," Marcus said. "An apology that says we were wrong to fear you, and we let that fear cost us the chance to understand what you actually were. That's the version that gets answered. My people don't respond to guilt, Voss. We respond to whether someone has actually finished thinking it through." I asked him the question I suspected the entire committee had been avoiding for months. "Do you think they'll ever answer, Marcus? Any version of this?" He considered it for a long time, watching the star chart on the display between us. "I think," he said, "you're asking the wrong question again. The question isn't whether they'll answer. The question is whether the Concord is actually prepared to hear what they'll say if they finally do." The third address was transmitted 4 days later, and this time, for the first time in 3 attempts, the boundary signal changed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over the following hours, the steady, unbroken rhythm that had marked the border for 7 years shifted, reshaping itself into something new, and every screen aboard the Halvorn Reach registered the change at almost the same moment. Talon moved quickly to the command display, and I followed close behind. Neither of us speaking as the ship's lead communications officer began relaying the translation in real time. "It's not a full response," she reported, her voice carefully controlled. "It's shorter. It repeats twice, then stops." The translation resolved a moment later, displayed plainly on every screen in the room. "Received." Considering the room remained silent for a long stretch afterward, no one quite certain how to respond to 2 words that represented, after 7 years of nothing, the very first acknowledgment humanity had offered the Concord since the exile vote. "It's not forgiveness," Talon said quietly, studying the translation. "No," I agreed, "but it's not silence either." Marcus, standing near the observation window, allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first I had seen from him in weeks. "It never was going to be forgiveness first," he said. "You don't get considered before you've actually finished admitting what you did. This is the first time in 7 years my people have decided the Concord was worth answering at all. That's not the ending you were hoping for, but it's further than either of your first 2 attempts deserved to get." I would file my report on the reconciliation address in the days that followed, though it bore little resemblance to the confident diplomatic triumph the office's public relations broadcasts had prepared before a single word had ever come back. I would describe, as carefully and neutrally as my position always required, the true shape of what had happened. Not a reconciliation completed, but a species patient enough to wait 7 years for an apology, honest enough to be worth considering, and precise enough in its silence, both before and after, to make certain the Concord understood exactly how much more thinking it still had left to do. I have come to believe that was the truest lesson of the entire affair. The Concord had spent 2 centuries assuming it understood humanity well enough to fear them, and 7 more years assuming it understood them well enough to apologize to them. In the end, all it had taken to learn otherwise was 2 words, sent back across a boundary the Concord itself had drawn, a response that offered neither closure nor comfort, only the quiet, unmistakable confirmation that the conversation was, for the first time, actually beginning.